Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video. In this video, I'm finally getting around to doing my player ranking for Big Brother 3 after my 20-year retrospective of the season. So obviously I have just recently rewatched the season of Big Brother 3, and I'll be ranking every player from that season based on how I feel like they played on that season. And this is a list that has actually changed quite a bit as time went on, especially towards the top of the list, where there are certain spots that have switched here and there, but obviously, we'll eventually get to that. But obviously, we'll start off right at the bottom here. The worst player of the season from Big Brother 3 to me. At number 12, we do have Lori, the first boot of the season. And I think this is a weird season where, like, to me, even the bottom place person here in Lori isn't necessarily the worst player in the world. I mean, I will say, actually, she's not the greatest player. I think I probably had a higher opinion of Lori coming into the rewatch than I did coming out of it, where, like, she is someone that does pick fights. She is someone that's kind of passive early on, where she was being used as the easy pawn, but then kind of, like, blows up her own spot. Like, she is actually a pretty bad player. But she just still end up leaving in a 5-4 vote, again, having 4 people on her side. Mind you, again, some of that is kind of rocky, where she does have a legitimately good relationship with Jason, but then you have Danielle and Josh both voting for her just because they promised her, not really because they actually wanted her to stay for any meaningful reason. And then she was close to Jerry, but I mean, it's Jerry. So I mean, like, really, like, while it was a very close vote, it wasn't really due to anything overly impressive that Lori did, especially because, like, she ends up losing out because of Roddy, who is someone that she did have a close relationship with and wasn't able to keep his vote in line. So, I mean, again, overall, like, that is pretty mediocre. And I think overall, like, my perceptions of her game ability definitely went down on the rewatch, where I remembered her being a bit more socially adept than what she really is. So yeah, at the end of the day, not the greatest player in the world. She's at the bottom here at number 12. At number 11, we're getting to the next boot, and that person is Tanya. And again, kind of a similar thing. I mean, I think Tanya is overall more playable in the game, but I mean, I think she's someone that just wasn't really playing the game that much. I mean, she is obviously the second boot of the season, in a position where some of her own alliance votes her out. I mean, Eric and Roddy vote her out. Mind you, she was against Josh, who obviously they were close to, so it is kind of redeemable, but Tanya is really just kind of a nothing player across this season. I mean, she's seemingly one of the people that doesn't play the game that much. We never really see her being that integral to any game conversations. I mean, she is initially left out of the majority, but is eventually brought in once Jerry blows up his game, and she's added in as a 6, and even then, that does cause chaos within that majority group, to where, again, the Eric, Roddy, and Joshes of the world don't like that she's being added to their alliance. Also, a decent amount of people in the house didn't seem to like her. People like a Danielle and a Marcellus and a Amy. We obviously see her pick a fight with Amy for, like, no real reason, especially, like, when she's on the block and Amy's one of the votes that she needs to keep herself in the game. Again, that's really bad gameplay. So, I mean, really, like, Tanya, again, like, it seems like a nothing player for the most part. Had some pretty poor strategic play, and also just didn't really seem to be liked by about half the house. And, like, while she was able to create a very strong core with Lisa and Kiara, and also had a decent relationship with Jerry, it's like, it's not enough to me to be that much higher on the list. She's here at number 11. Now, number 10, we're jumping forward quite a bit to someone that made it all the way to the final 4, and that person is Amy. Now, obviously, Amy was technically the next boot as well. She was the third boot of the season, came back into the game, only be voted out the final 4. And again, like, I don't really think Amy had much game ability across the season. I mean, she's someone that didn't really seem to get the game from a strategic level, and also just seemed to annoy a lot of the people in there. I mean, she is obviously booted the week that Roddy goes home, when she's against Marcellus, someone that should have been perceived as a more dangerous player, yet they get rid of Amy just to keep peace in the house, which I think is a pretty bad sign there. I mean, she obviously picks the fight with Kiara, and, like, they had a very big rivalry, and that's pretty bad. I mean, really everything within the first, like, 3 rounds of the game that she's there is pretty bad. I mean, like, she even barely survives over Lori, someone that was kind of blowing up her own game by the end. You have her being the easy target the week she goes home. So again, like, the first 3 rounds she plays are pretty bad. I think when she comes back into the game, she does make an optimal move in targeting Kiara. The problem is that I think a lot of that was not because of game reasons, but more so because of her personal hatred towards Kiara. And even along the way, she's almost manipulated into using the veto on Roddy in a position that she would have gone home had she done so. And even then, she regrets not doing it, even at the point where she recognizes that she would have gone home had she not done so. She's constantly used as a pawn throughout the season, largely because she has no leverage in the game, because when she comes back, there's the plan to immediately boot her right away. That doesn't end up going through, but it does make her a very clear GOAT to take to the end. And even in that position, she's not even used as a GOAT, despite being a massive GOAT, where Danielle and Jason decide to risk their game and taking Lisa to the end over Amy, despite the fact that Lisa would have had a better chance of beating them at the end than Amy. And I think all this is just really, really bad. I mean, despite the fact that she has more longevity in the game than a lot of the people we're about to be talking about, her game is pretty bad when you think about it, where she should have been the final two for all intents and purposes and just isn't. And because of that, again, I had to leave Amy here at number 10. Now, number 9, we're going back a few spots, but not as many spots as what we could have. And at number 9, we do have Jerry. And I did not remember how bad of a player Jerry was until this rewatch. Like, I always remember Jerry as, like, yeah, someone that, like, kind of got on his high horse and did make the bad move of using the veto on Marcellus, but I didn't realize how big of a social pariah he was in the game until this rewatch, where he really has no leverage throughout a lot of this season, where, like, initially he's part of that core majority group. Like, they initially make this majority group with the couples and Josh, and they add Jerry in, and Jerry's part of this initial power structure, but then decides to actively blow it all up to save Marcellus. And what, again, like, is a respectable move on paper in terms of the outside world, but then, like, you also realize he's kind of doing this for his own ego, and he's not actually doing this because he actually cares about what he preaches. And I feel like that's the point where my opinion of Jerry just completely goes downhill, where he does become kind of an egomaniac in the sense that he puts himself on such a pedestal that obviously just annoys everyone else there. And really, he's just a social pariah for the rest of his run. Now, I mean, that doesn't mean he doesn't make decent moves here and there. I mean, again, he does make this deal with Roddy that keeps him safe. He does target Eric and really blows up the opposite side through doing so, and I think that's really great, though. I mean, obviously I would give more of the credit to Danielle and Jason for that, but I mean, like, still, Jerry's the one that executed the plan. I still think he deserves some credit there, but I mean, really, he's just someone that's easy to pick off along the way. I mean, someone that is still dangerous enough to where he can win competitions, to where you can't really leave him in there to the final two, unlike someone like an Amy, but is also someone that still has no winnability in the game. Like, I don't know how he wins the game unless he's against Amy, and even then, I don't know if it's even gonna happen for him. I mean, like, I just don't see much potential in him to win the game here, even though he does make some optimal moves here and there, but again, also makes some really terrible moves, with his move to save Marcellus being one that is really, really bad, that completely blows up his game. And because of that, I will leave Jerry here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to an interesting player from this season, and one that I do think is kind of hard to wrap my head around, and that person is Josh. Now, the thing about Josh is Josh plays probably the hardest out of anyone in the first half of the game, and with that comes good and bad. I do think he does good work in really trying to solidify this power structure that comes together in week 1, where he is aligned with Eric, Lisa, Kiara, and Roddy, and then also Jerry. And even beyond Jerry blowing up his own game, he's still very tightly aligned with Eric and Roddy that ends up saving him in week 2. And also he has this really strong bond with Danielle. He does active work in trying to pull in Jason. He also does active work in building a bond with Amy. Like, he does very strong work. The week that he's on the block, he is a pretty integral piece for the middle of the house, to where he's someone that Danielle uses pretty effectively. But, I mean, through him having these relationships with that middle contingent, he also has good relationships with Eric and Roddy, which actually puts him in a decent spot, to where despite his overall winnability probably being relatively low, to where, like, I don't know if anyone would have respected him if he got to the end, he still avoids being targeted when Jerry is HOH, despite Jerry having every right to target him at that point, and does end up building a decent bond with Jerry at that point, to where I don't think Jerry would have gone against Josh at that point. Then we obviously have the clear negatives, which is the fact that he grossly overplays, especially in the sense that he lets everyone knows that he's playing really hard, where, like, everyone knows how much he's scheming and how much he's making deals with everyone, and everyone just looks at him as a very sketchy figure. Also, I mean, I think him really trying to get out Lisa in the battle between Lisa and Eric really does end up backfiring on him. And while obviously, like, keeping Eric in the game is much more beneficial for Josh than Lisa, campaigning really hard to the point where, like, he's lying to Kiara about what Lisa said, like, that really ends up being the detriment of his game. Mind you, obviously he gets unlucky in the fact that Kiara wins the next HOH, which allows him to be targeted. But like, I mean, to be fair, even then, like, he almost stays. Like, I mean, there are people that are trying to pull the votes together to keep him around. It did seem like at one point the votes were there to keep him around over Roddy, who does come out as a really big threat at that point. So again, like, he is someone that does play the game way too hard and makes it very open that he is playing the game way too hard. But I mean, like, he does have some impressive work here and there to where, like, I think there's a debate for him being a few spots higher, to be honest. It's really his overall lack of win potential that does knock him down a bit, where, again, like, I don't think he can win the game, despite him doing some decent work here and there. But again, like, overall, mixed game here at number 8. Now, number 7, we have someone that I forgot how poorly they played the last few rounds of their game, but is also someone that, again, like, also, like, had some decent positioning here and there, but to me is probably more of an actively bad player than Josh to me, even though this person had more overall game potential, and that person is Kiara, where I think Kiara's last 2 rounds are really, really bad. Like, I really forgot how bad her HOH reign is, to where I think this is one that's criminally underrated as one of the worst HOHs of all time, where despite the fact that Josh does lie to her in the previous round, she decides to target Josh in a position where her, Roddy, and Josh are essentially on the bottom, and she's just really helping Danielle and Jason take over the game through doing so, while putting her in a position where she's a clear target for the very next round. All while also, like, not even guaranteeing that Josh is going to go home, because she nominates Roddy, her number 1 ally, against him in a position where Roddy almost goes home. So again, all of this is like really, really bad. Like, to me, it's a all-time worst HOH. But again, like, she is this high because, again, she does have more winnability if she gets to the end. I do think she is someone that was, for the most part, well-liked by the house. Like, she obviously has the rivalry with Amy, but I think for the most part, there are definitely people that would have respected her by the end. Like, Danielle and Jason liked her, Roddy, obviously, maybe an Eric, obviously Tanya, maybe Josh. Again, there's people that would vote for her at the end. And also, I feel like early on, she was, like, decently positioned. I mean, she wasn't, like, the best position in the game. Again, I do think her pulling in Tanya into the alliance was something that made the guys kind of scared of them, which caused Tanya to go home. And she was, like, on the outs for that vote, obviously. But, I mean, she was still part of that initial power structure that, had it not been for Jason and Danielle being as savvy players as they were, I do think probably would have run the show moving forward. But again, Kiara, for me, really terrible HOH that completely sunk her game. And also was just getting outplayed by other people along the way. So again, I have to leave her here at number 7. Now number 6. I can't believe this person's here at number 6. Like, how? But at number 6, the earliest boot left on the board, we do have Eric. And again, like, I don't think Eric played that poorly on this season. And while Eric's not necessarily this, like, big strategic mastermind by any means, I think Eric is probably one of the more solid, like, all-around players on this season. I mean, he is part of the initial power structure where him and Roddy seem to be very tight, to where I would have expected them to take each other to the end. He also has a relationship with Lisa, which is obviously very close there. Kiara even flips on Lisa to keep Eric in the game. So again, like, he's in a very good spot in that initial alliance, also seeming to be one of the better competitors in the house. He also almost stays in the house, to where it had to be a tie vote, and even then, I don't think that situation would have even happened had Danielle and Marcellus fought as hard as they did to get Eric out of the house, considering it wasn't really the optimal move necessarily. Now, obviously, at the end of the day, he does have a massive lack of threat management, to where anyone that wasn't in his core was directly targeting him. Where, again, we have Danielle and Marcellus directly want him out. And along with that came Jason, and then obviously Jerry. And really, it would have been hard to believe that he wouldn't have been targeted at least at some point down the road. So again, I mean, there was a lack of threat management, but I think for the most part, he actually plays decently. Like, I don't think there's, like, a massive glaring hole in his game like there is with any of the people we've talked about so far. So I think he's one of the more competent people on the board. He's here at number 6. Now number 5, and this is where it gets a bit tougher for me, where I think this is where I started to move around a lot of spots, where at number 5 here is actually someone that debatably was number 3 or 4 for me coming into the list. However, I just did not love their game as much as I did on this rewatch from where I was beforehand. And at number 5 here, we do have Roddy. And Roddy is someone that I always remembered as one of the most underrated players from the early days, where he is this person that is extremely manipulative and very charming, and through that gets his way at certain points in the game, but is also one of these people that, like, gets this version of the game. Again, while this is not necessarily the game you would want to play after the sequestered jury comes into play, he is someone that gets gets that this is a game where people are going home and going to watch the show and watch the feeds. And through that, he acts accordingly. Like, he gets the impact of perception and how to play up to what people want. And I think that is something that is very impressive about Roddy's game, is his full understanding of that element of the game. However, on the rewatch, I'm definitely much lower on his game, particularly in the fact that he loses all control once Eric goes home. I mean, he is like very well positioned for first 2 weeks, where again, I would say he's the best positioned at that point. But once Eric goes home, his game completely unravels at that point, where his power structure is crumbled. Kiara and Lisa are after each other, so they don't have the numbers anymore. Jason and Danielle really take control, and at that point, he's really fighting from the bottom from that point forward, and somehow squeaks on by week after week, where again, like, he's on the block against Josh in a position where the vote is almost flipped on Roddy. However, it ends up not doing so, just due to some people feeling bad, which again, like, kind of credit to him for them feeling bad about voting him out, but I don't know how much active work Roddy really did for that specific week. And the flip almost happens again once he's on the block against Kiara, to where Danielle is really trying to get him out, but the flip is stopped once again there. And I think probably what's the best display of gameplay for him across these rounds is really in his last couple rounds, where at the final 7, Jason wins HOH. And I think he does very impressive work guilting Jason into not putting him on the block. And really, that's probably one of the bigger holes in Jason's game that I did not remember until this rewatch, is how Roddy is able to convince Jason not to put him on the block. And I think that's very impressive work at the final 7. And at the final 6, I think it's very impressive work that Roddy was almost able to get Amy to use the veto on him, to the point where she regrets not doing so after she does. And again, like, all this is like pretty good work. Now, obviously, it's entrenched in also some pretty poor play. Mind you, some poor play perpetuated by the fact that he didn't want to openly lie to people under the perception that they would not vote for him because they would see that on the show. But I mean, again, like, I think there's massive highs and massive lows for Roddy's game. I mean, he is a player that did hold back because he knew that people were going to watch the show and didn't want to be perceived in a negative light. And I think that's something that you have to factor in here. But also, again, he does spend most of the game on the bottom, like literally like over half the game. He is in a position where he is going to be targeted coming into the round and kind of just like barely scrapes on by throughout certain situations. But again, I think he is potentially one of the better players on the board, but in terms of the game he played, again, just too much time not really in control of the game, so he ends up landing here number 5. Now number 4, and we're moving on to a player that, again, is universally looked at as a bad player, largely due to the one really dumb move that they end up making. But I think when you look at their game as a whole, it's not as bad as people say. At number 4, we have Marcellus. And again, like, Marcellus is someone that, if you take out the really, really dumb move of not using the veto on yourself at the final 5, I think he plays a solid game. Again, it's not an overly great game where, again, he is being outplayed by Jason and Danielle throughout a lot of the season, where he thinks that he's in a 3-person alliance with them, but really he's on the bottom of that 3, with them planning on taking him out towards the end game, which they end up eventually doing. But I mean, again, like, I think for most of the season, he's probably like, what, the 3rd or 4th best positioned person in the house. Like, he's obviously targeted week 1 and does get saved by Jerry using the veto, but beyond that, like, he's back in a pretty decent spot. I mean, like, he is someone that is mostly well liked by the house, to where I think if it had not been for them seeing what he said on the show, he probably is a likely winner at the end. Now, I think the problem is that he does get to the end against some of the bigger jury threats in the game, and Jason and Roddy and Lisa. But I think Marcellus is definitely someone that could have potentially won the game in other scenarios. And I also feel like Marcellus's strategic ability is somewhat understated, where I was actually kind of surprised watching some of the earlier weeks where Marcellus, to me, had a more optimal game plan than Danielle, where we see these conversations between Danielle and Marcellus where, like, Danielle really wants to get rid of Jerry week 2, and, like, to me that just makes no sense. Like, I really don't get why she would want to do that when Jerry is just such an easy person to use as a shield moving forward, and is also someone that is more on your side than specifically someone like a Tanya. So, like, I really don't get why Danielle fights so hard to get Jerry on the block, and it's really Marcellus that has to tell her, no, we're not doing that. And I think, like, in terms of the early game, I think based on what we were shown, I actually agree with more of what Marcellus is doing than Danielle. But I mean, at the end of the day, again, like, Marcellus is still not like an all-time great player by any means. Again, he still has obviously plenty of mistakes. Obviously, the veto at 5, again, not playing on yourself is asinine. And, like, while, like, I don't know if he would have won the game anyway, where like at that point he would be at the Final Four. He would need to win Final Four HOH in position where Danielle won the actual HOH, where if that had not been the case, he would have been out at 4 anyway. But if he wins that, even at that point, he's probably going to let Amy go home in a position where, again, he needs to win final HOH. He essentially needs to win out at that point. And even in that scenario, I don't know if he beats Jason, where from all of the readings I have done on interviews at the time, it does seem like Jason was the biggest jury threat of them all. To where, like, I don't know if the winning scenario was necessarily there. Though, to be fair, I mean, he was probably taking Danielle, and in that position he probably wins. But again, like, I mean, still, it's like, it's not an easy road to the end for him. A very mixed game at the end of the day for me. But again, like, I still think it's probably one of the better ones on the board here, and he does land here number 4. Now number 3, and we're at the top 3. I mean, we have probably one of the best top 3s in the history of the show. The question is the order, and I mean, if you know me, you should know who's at the bottom of this 3. At number 3, we do have Lisa, who obviously ends up winning the season. But again, like, to me, Lisa obviously was not as well positioned in the game as either Danielle or Jason. I mean, she was someone that was on the bottom of that trio, and even then, like, kind of gets added late into that trio, where again, she eventually, like, kind of takes Marcel's spot. But she's someone that I think her early game's pretty mediocre, actually. I mean, like, round 1, she does become the first HOH, and again, she is part of the initial power structure, and again, that is the benefit of the first HOH. But even beyond that, I mean, she's kind of on the bottom of that power structure, where Kiara and Lisa don't seem to be as close as Roddy and Eric do. And then also, once Tanya gets brought in, Tanya and Kiara are much closer to each other than they are to Lisa. And I think she kind of gets lucked out by the way the game progresses moving forward, where, like, again, Tanya goes home where she didn't want that to happen and wasn't really in on that plan. And while, to be fair, it probably wasn't optimal for that to happen for her, again, she's completely on the outs there. I think she's in pretty bad position once Jerry wins HOH, where it does seem like Lisa is the initial target, though the target obviously ends up flipping onto Eric. And some of this, I think you have the credit to her building a pretty strong relationship with Danielle, to where Danielle wants to flip the votes into making that happen. But even along the way, I mean, she loses the vote of Kiara, and again, just barely gets saved there. But again, obviously from that point, like, her game ends up being pretty solid. But again, it's still one where she's, like, kind of being outplayed by Jason and Danielle, where they're really the ones that are making the power moves, especially Danielle, for a lot of that. And it's really Lisa kind of just benefiting from that. And again, you'd have to credit Lisa for building this bond with Danielle to where Danielle wants to take her to the end. But I just feel like Lisa had very little agency along the way. Like, even at the time that Marcellus ends up going home, like, Lisa didn't want Marcellus to go home and was actively trying to not get Marcellus to go home, ends up failing at doing so. And as much as I will criticize Jason and Danielle for wanting to take Lisa to the final 3 over Amy, I'll also criticize Lisa here for also wanting to take Jason and Danielle to the final 3 over Amy, which is also a really bad move from Lisa's end, where Jason and Danielle are harder to beat at the end and also are taking each other for sure. So I think that's also a suboptimal move there. Now, I will say that I do think her game is one that is a lot more playable to people that are watching from home, especially against Danielle. Again, especially when she's like this person that turns down all the offers during the luxury competition, so that it makes her look selfless to the players at home, which again obviously like boosts her perception in the game. But again, I don't know how much of that was active, and really, like, as a whole, like, she plays a very, like, solid game, especially for this era. But I mean, again, against the other 2 people that she ends up beating out here, I just think they were more consistent along the way, had more control along the way. But again, not saying that Lisa had no game ability here. Again, I still think she is a very competent player here, but one that I just don't feel like had as much control in the game as I would have liked, and because of that, she lands here at number 3. Now number 2, and this was tough. Again, like, obviously the top 2 are obvious. Like, coming in this video, you should have known who the top 2 were. Though I will say, even I didn't know where I was going to go with these top 2, because to me, they are very, very close, with both having holes in their games that really the question is, which one do you demerit more? Where one was better positioned in the game to where they were very rarely in danger in most scenarios and was more strategically active in the game but rarely wins the game, while the other person was adored by the jury and supposedly was the biggest jury threat out there and seemed to be the more well-rounded player as a whole, but also was the person that was more targeted along the way and needed the help of the other person. And I really just didn't know where to go with here, because again, I came into this list with the opposite position, but I think at this point I think I'm going to go the other way. At number 2, I do have Jason. And again, like, this is a last second change. I thought coming into this video, Jason would be number 1. I thought coming into the rewatch, Jason would be number 1. I thought for a very long time that Jason would be number 1. However, something I did not remember about Jason is a couple things. I mean, one, I think strategically, it's not really all there. Like, I think he does a good job at managing his threat level. It seems like that's something he was very aware of coming into the season. He's also someone that very much caters to the jury. Mind you, I don't know how much of that is just Jason's natural personality, which I suspect a lot of it is. But again, he is someone that is a very playable figure and someone that the jury just really liked. However, I don't think, again, strategically, he's all there. I think his move to not target Roddy at the final 7 is something that is pretty indicative of that. Again, he is someone that is malleable to Roddy's manipulations, and I feel like that's obviously a knock there, especially when, like, everyone else in the house is telling him to put up Roddy. And, like, to be fair, I don't know how optimal a move it is for Jason himself to be doing it, but the fact that, like, literally the entire house is telling you to do so. But again, they're not really doing it in a way that's like they're trying to trick him into doing it. They're doing it because they legitimately think that Roddy is the biggest threat in the game. And I think if this had been a modern season Big Brother, I think this would have been a massive knock against Jason, to where I think he would have lost a lot of respect through this move. But also, I forgot how much he was targeted across the season. I think him not going on the block throughout the entire season, I think you do have to credit a lot of that to Danielle. And, like, obviously he doesn't end up going on the block the entire season until the very, very end. But, I mean, there's so many points where he is in danger. And I would not be surprised if it was the work of Danielle that did greatly benefit him in not eventually hitting the block. And I think there's a lot of points where he's making moves that are more optimal for Danielle than they are for him. Obviously, voting out Amy over Lisa is a very short-sighted move on his end. I think something that does benefit Danielle, though, to be fair, I mean, Amy was also taking Danielle, so I mean, really, it doesn't really matter that much anyway. But again, something that's really bad for Jason there. You have him, like, continuously lying about voting Eric out, which just further burns his bridges with the Roddy Kiara side of things, which I think is pretty poor play on that front as well. And again, something that he does to help Danielle out in the game, and also causes him to be a potential nominee from Kiara when Kiara wins HOH. And the same thing goes with when Jerry wins HOH. Both times he is worried that he's going to be on the block because he doesn't have that good of a relationship with Jerry. And even in the end game, I mean, he's in a more dangerous spot where obviously both Lisa and Amy were planning on taking Danielle to the end. So had, like, Amy won Final 4 HOH, Jason is dead. He's 100% going home. Had the Final 5 round played out a bit differently, Jason would have definitely been targeted there. Like, I mean, there's definitely more holes in Jason's game than I remembered, even though I still think he is one of the better all-around players, especially at this point in Big Brother history. But again, it's not to say that he played a perfect game, and I think especially in comparison to the other person we'll be talking about, even though she also has very big holes in her game, it's like I feel like at least she got her way throughout more of the game and had the game moving in a direction that greatly benefited her more so than Jason did. Where I will credit him for him being the one that Danielle picked, and I think he ends up doing some good work along the way as well, but I also feel like there's enough bad there to leave him off in that number 1 spot, so he's here number 2. And we are at number 1. The best player from BB3 to me is Danielle. And again, at first, it was Jason. And I think a lot of that was stemmed from the fact that Jason was the biggest jury threat on the board. Where, again, I did a lot of research into looking up old interviews and everything. And almost every interview mentioned that they were rooting for Jason and Roddy to win the season after they had already left the house. So that's something that definitely boosted Jason to me. But again, I think when watching the season, it's just Danielle gets her way over Jason, is better positioned than Jason throughout the entire game, which I do think greatly boons her for me. Again, like, while Danielle had terrible jury management in a position where she knew that the jury was going to watch the TV show, that's bad. That's really, really bad. Like, the way that she continuously talks about Roddy as the devil and does make some comments in the ER that people don't like. Again, it's bad gameplay from a jury management perspective. But in terms of her navigation to the end, I think she's number 1 by a lot. I mean, she is by far the best strategic player on this cast. I think she's one of the better social players on this cast in terms of how well like they were within the house. It's really just that lack of jury management that really harms her to a degree. Now, I will say that I think if she was at the end against Lisa or Jason in a natural jury vote, she would also probably lose. Like, really, I do think there is something lacking there in terms of her overall killer instinct, where obviously she has the killer instinct to, like, blindside Marcellus, but even then, that was in a position where she was trying to save Jason. Like, I think she is lacking that killer instinct in terms of her cutting Jason and cutting Lisa, which is something that she would have needed to do to win the game. She needed to get to the end against Amy in order to win, and just doesn't end up doing so. And really, I mean, I think that's a lot of the bigger knocks of Danielle's game from the in-game perspective, is she is doing a lot of work to keep Jason safe. Where, again, Jason is in danger a lot more of the game, and Danielle is having to put out those fires constantly. And at points, does make moves that are to keep Jason safe. But to be fair, I mean, again, despite that, Danielle is still in a great position in the game. Like, she does obviously burn Marcellus in order to save Jason, but is also still the best position in the game. I mean, she's in a position where at the Final Four, literally everyone is taking her to the end. Again, this is like a stat that is very rarely seen. I mean, the only person I can think of at the top of my mind is someone like a Derek. This is a similar case for, like, where, like, again, Danielle had Lisa wanting to take her to the end. Jason wanted to take her to the end. Amy wanted to take her to the end. Even Marcellus would have probably taken her to the end, especially at this point where Amy had kind of burnt her bridges. So, I mean, at that point, we're talking about Final Five. Like, that is insane. And, like, while she does, like, do very poor work with Roddy, in my opinion, we still had, like, Jerry leaving the house talking about how he wanted to vote for Danielle. Kiara was pro-Danielle on her way out. Josh was pro-Danielle. Lori was pro-Danielle. I mean, Danielle had, like, so many good relationships with these people while they were in the house, and obviously that does sour when they leave. And I think they also would have soured even in the jury house. Had that been a thing, considering I do think Roddy still would have been angry at Danielle, would have turned like people like a Kiara against her. And I think she probably still loses a jury vote, but to be honest, it's much closer. Like, I think she for sure gets the votes of a Josh and a Jerry in that situation. And I think Amy would be determined on how Marcellus reacted. But still, I mean, like, I think as a whole, Danielle was just really, really good socially throughout this game. Really good at positioning herself in the game to where almost everyone wanted to take her to the end. And not because they thought she was a GOAT. Like, this isn't a situation where, like, everyone thought Danielle was going to lose at the end. Again, everyone just loved Danielle while they were in there. It's not until after they left that they realized how much they didn't like her. So, again, that's impressive. I think her overall strategic ability is very impressive as well. Again, like, I think the Eric move is pretty masterful, the way that they're able to blindside Eric, completely crumble Roddy's power structure, and along the way also get Kiara to vote for Lisa through Jason's continuous lying about his vote, which through that burns Lisa's relationship with Kiara, which puts both of them closer to her. Again, it's very masterful work. I think the way that she handles the Eric round is pretty incredible. I do think the first few rounds are probably not as good as I remember, though. Again, she's kind of on the outs those first few rounds, where it's not until like mid week 1 that she creates that bond with Jason. And even then, it's like she doesn't really have any leverage. But again, she waits it out, makes the move when she had to, and then from there on, like, plays a pretty optimal game in terms of getting to the end. But obviously, the lack of jury management is the main negative here. But I still think as a whole, Danielle plays a very strong game across the season. And while my opinion of it didn't really go up too much on the rewatch, I do think with my opinion of Jason's game going down slightly, it does leave Danielle here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every player from Big Brother 3. Now, moving forward next year, I will probably be doing a similar thing for Big Brother 4. So stay tuned for that. And obviously more of the same Big Brother Survivor videos down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.